All right, then let's get into history books and look back when you came over, I guess 98 and 99, dealing with Zhuangzi and the likes. What was your impression, the kind of earnesty, the kind of, were they really willing to enter the WTO and willing to sacrifice with some economic reforms?
First of all, it's wonderful to be here, and it's particularly wonderful to see you. Um, China's accession process was very lengthy. It took perhaps 13 years. And it took that long for a couple of reasons. And this bears on your question about Zhuangzi. It took a long time, first of all, for China's economy and China's political leaders to mature to a point where they could be potentially receptive to WTO admission, and where the economy was mature enough to a point where it could actually make changes, go deeper into reform without destroying the economic activity that had taken place thus far. So one reason this process was very extended was that you needed a combination of an economy mature enough to take that next step and a political leadership who understood what that next step might actually mean in terms of breadth of reform, depth of reform, and the coverage over the entirety of the tradable economy: goods, services, agriculture, the rules, the regulations, transparency, so on and so forth. That process of maturation, I would say, took from the mid-80s to roughly the mid-1990s. And in the mid-1990s, the Chinese leadership was made aware of how radical a change in its economy, acceding to the WTO, would entail. Zhuangzi was particularly critical in this because of his background, because of the sheer power of his intellect, and because of his conception of how a country would develop, how to accelerate development, how to develop in a way that was sustainable and that would increase standards of living, increase economic output without being destabilizing to the economy and to the population. So his intellect and his foresight was really the critical driving factor once the leadership as a whole began to understand what would be involved in an accession. The other thing at that time that was made clear to the leadership was that there would be no political accession. I think for many years, China had operated under the assumption that it might do a little bit here, a little bit there, but really, because it's large, there would be political necessity about the notion of China acceding. There was no political necessity from the US point of view. There was only a substantive series of changes that could lead to WTO admission. So process of maturation, understanding there was no political accession, understanding what accession would actually entail, and thinking through that. And then, of course, at the end of the day, making that leap of faith, because you can't really be sure what will happen. And China's scale is so unlike any other country. Of course, prior precedent might not apply when it came to making changes of the magnitude required. So there was a combination of factors, and that meant a lengthy process, and it made Zhuangzi really the linchpin of that process.
I remember those days, there were lots of books and articles here in Beijing against China's accession to WTO. There was a fierce policy discussion going on in order not to showcase how difficult it would be. But it seemed to me, as an outsider at that time, that Zhou Enlai needed an outside force in order to remove and reorganize the furniture, so to speak, in China. Now, he went to Washington in 1999, and there was a deal, and still negotiations weren't concluded, and he left frustrated. I think it was for Canada. And then the deal basically was put on hold for 1 year until you came back here, and then 2001 actually got it done. So when you were seeing this kind of backlash from the Chinese system, the interest groups lobbying, what do you think was Zhou Enlai's biggest fear?
I think there were probably two areas of concern. One was what would be done with the state enterprises. He knew that they were a fiscal drain. They were, at that time, a pretty bad investment. They sopped up a lot of capital for very little output, and they were not innovative. So something had to be done there. He knew that. He could use WTO accession as a reason for further consolidation, as a reason to let some of these companies go. That was one area, because, of course, that's a very fraught area. It's an area that's close to the party and party politics and so on and so forth. The other area that I think was of significant concern to him was the services area in general. If you think back at that time, China's services market was very underdeveloped, and its services companies were also underdeveloped. And there was a great concern that if the services market were simply to open, every bank in China would be American or European. Every telecom facility would be American or European or Japanese, for example, so on and so forth, all the way down the line. Every insurance policy written would be American or European or Japanese. And so there was a concern that China be able to develop an indigenous service sector. On the other hand, he understood that China needed that foreign participation in order to help put together a sector that was perhaps survivable. So the concern in that area was, if foreign companies come in at all, will they take over? Because they're so big, they're so powerful, and they're so expert. And would then China be at a permanent disadvantage? So I think those were the two areas of particular concern, both of which were resolved. State enterprises, on the one hand, we had very tough language on state enterprises, which I regret to say no U.S. administration has used in a WTO dispute against China, yet one of the enduring mysteries. And the services sector was opened only very, very gradually, first on a geographic basis and subsequently across the country, but slowly. And that actually provided important opportunity for US and European and other foreign companies to come in, but provided opportunity to the Chinese that those companies not so dominate that China's own companies wouldn't have an opportunity.
To me, it looked like the great financial crisis of 2008, 2009 has robbed the West of its allure of being better, economically more stable, having the better model. And then China realized maybe that's not the case, so we don't have to listen to them anymore. What's your look, looking back 20 years of the kind of involvement of China and WTO and the willingness to reform?
So in the early years of WTO accession, China's economy was on a convergent course toward market-based economics and market-based norms. Not the same as the market, but on a convergent course toward. And the way I thought about it was, if you have economic systems that are different or somewhat different, but are sufficiently compatible, that works. Actually, it works for everybody. China was on that course of convergence and greater compatibility until actually, Jörg, about 2006, 2007. So the first element of potential divergence from market norms was a creation of the Indigenous Innovation Program. The notion that China needed to develop certain technologies and industries on its own, that these should be indigenized, they should be created by indigenous Chinese companies, and these companies should have special preferences as a matter of national interest. Of course, indigenous innovation morphed into the designation of strategic emerging industries, which morphed into Made in China 2025, which has since morphed and morphed again. So this period of early divergence in 06, 07 became accelerated as the years went on. And under Xi Jinping, of course, the divergence is very dramatic. And as Xi Jinping says, irreversible. So the situation now is an economic model that diverges from market norms. It is state-led, it is subsidy-fueled, it is highly mercantilistic in orientation. And so this creates an enormous amount of friction with China's major trading partners, who bear the brunt of this divergent economic model. So it's really this divergence that started early on that laid the foundation. You are right to point to 2008, 2009, because there is no question that the US financial meltdown, which of course became a global financial meltdown, demonstrated a couple of things. First of all, that the US had mismanaged economically its own economy and a large part of the global economy. Second, that this model led to such instability in the country, high unemployment, even sharper income inequality, and so on, that surely, in China's mind, this is not a model we want to follow. And third, of course, because this implosion was so significant, the US withdrew in many ways from international leadership, leaving a vacuum. So a combination of those factors helped to fuel and accelerate this divergent course of action on the part of China, and has helped cement an economic framework in China that's antithetical to market-based norms and the WTO.
I mean, we had last year 3 occasions where we possibly hope that there will be a little bit of policy discussion about the virtue of opening up, the virtue of trading and investment. First of all, with phase 1, then second with RCEP, and then the third one in December with the CAI. But here in Beijing, we didn't really pick up any policy discussions about this. It was all possibly down to mercantilist dealings of getting the best deal of it, but not changing their own system. What a difference 20 years had. So in a way, looking back, the years of Clinton, Jiang Zemin, and Zhu Ji were the golden ages, huh?
You know, it's interesting. For trade liberalization and this greater compatibility, that was the golden age. What I find really fascinating is that it isn't just Xi Jinping that has moved away from liberalization, right? He talks about the Mao period, the Deng Xiaoping period, which he characterized as one of rapid growth and development. And his period is not a liberalization period. It is build the strength of China. Yes, there are targeted market openings in areas where either China's behind or it wants a degree of international imprimatur. Financial sector opening is one of those areas, but foreign companies will never have any significant share in the China market. This is absolutely critical or absolutely clear. So that's sort of one piece, if you will, of this of sort of on the China side on liberalization. But if you look at the USTR speech that came out not long ago, the pursuit of liberalization is actually not on the agenda. Right? What's on the agenda is called a worker-specific trade policy, a worker-friendly policy, which is good. I have no objection to that rhetoric. I think every USTR believes he or she helped to create jobs in the United States. But the focus really is on things like Buy America, things like supply chain security and reshoring, elements that one doesn't think about in the context of liberalization. And the very language of trade opening, reform and opening, further opening, is largely absent from the speeches given by USTR now. So there is something of a pullback all around. And you see this in part in Europe as well, but a pullback certainly in the US, and a pullback, including, by the way, in the US, not joining TPP or CPTPP rather, and being very careful about announcing any trade agreements. You'll notice that Commerce Secretary Raimundo talked about a new Asia-Pacific framework and then made clear it wasn't a trade agreement. So there's this very odd thing going on now, we see among the larger economies, where what was prized in the earlier years, that is further integration, further liberalization, further equitable trade, really has changed quite considerably. Perhaps equitable trade is still around, but the rest is largely absent.
Yeah. So what would you suggest Europeans should do? Align more strongly with the United States, trying to find more common topics, continue doing free trade agreements with East Asian economies? What would you recommend to European decision makers?
Europe should be doing what the US is doing. That is to say, the number one job, and to my mind, it is number one by an enormous distance from number two, is to increase your own resiliency. Increase the resiliency of the European economy, increase the resiliency of European defense and diplomacy, increase the resiliency of your people. Whatever happens with China is rather beside the point in that regard. Countries are great because they are strong in the right ways, and that necessarily means economically. It means in terms of defense or security, let's call it security, and in terms of diplomacy. And all of the things that those three vectors allow you to do as a nation, allows for the positive projection of power, allows for humanitarian and other forms of assistance that really does go to the right places, that also allows for the effective disciplining of countries that are renegade, if you will, or that are destructive to the global commons. This is the focus of the Biden administration for the US, and I think he's right, and it is the number one focus. But I think it should be the number one focus of Europe as well. Europe is strongest if the US is strongest at the same time. The US is strongest if Europe is strongest at the same time. A weak one or the other is in neither set of countries' interests at all. So that's point one. I think the second point is countries should work with each other where their interests align. In the case of China, the picture for Europe is more complicated than it is for the United States. Germany is quite export dependent on China. The US is not nearly as export dependent on China. European member states differ on how to deal with China. The US is of one mind. at this point. And we can argue about whether it's in the right mindset, but it's at one mind at this point. Europe, in general, seeks to have more positive relations with other countries. The US, at least in years gone by, was more often than not on its high horse a bit. I think those days are over, but still some of that remains. And of course, Europe doesn't really have an interest in fighting China to ensure the US remains number one. The US looks at this very differently. Not necessarily that the US should remain number one, but that the US needs to be, if not the largest economy, certainly the preeminent economy. So US and European interests will often diverge. There are some areas where the interests should be right on a convergent course, and indeed converge. And that is in the areas of unfair trade practices, of unrestrained subsidies, of mercantilism at scale. These are things as threatening to Europe as they are to the United States, whether practiced by China or any other major economy. And on some of these issues, I think the US and Europe can work very, very well together. In other issues, I think they will probably not. I think they'll work very well together on human rights related issues. Certainly, they already have been. Then we come to the issue of tone. The US, we have that sort of Western cowboy affect. This is not actually Europe's affect. So tone is often a problem and often a point of disagreement, if you will. But bottom line is, I think step one for both countries, if I can call Europe a country just for a moment, for symmetry's sake, is to self-strengthen. Nothing's more important. And then step two, in the case of China, would be to truly look for those areas of convergence, be honest about it, right? Where the interests don't align, they don't align. Don't waste time pretending they do, but be honest about it. And then try and come up with a program, the point of which should be to see if it's possible, and it may not be, but to see if it's possible to nudge China back toward a more convergent economic course, and to pull away from the more damaging aspects of its current economic model.
Coming to the end of this, a more private question. You and me, on separate occasions, were privileged to meet the retired Prime Minister Zhou Ji. And when I met him, he said he was really in awe of your negotiation skills. He said she was really tough. And he mentioned that you actually came to the Great Hall of the People. The deal was not confirmed or done, but you checked out of the hotel and sent your suitcases to the airport already. Is that actually true?
Yes. Yes. There's a point in a negotiation where it's, at the end of the day, it's either yes or no, right? Yeah. And the longer the time between yes or no, the more you lose.
Yeah.
Interest dissipates. People get tired of the issues. They don't want to think about it all the time. They just want a break. And the problem with most negotiations is that if you break at the wrong time, you never come back. Not in the same way. You just don't. It's either there or it isn't there. It's time or it isn't time. Well, my view was that we had spent quite long enough. Every issue had been exhaustively discussed, regurgitated, and discussed again. And it was enough. Time for yes or no on the following issues. And if it wasn't a yes or no, right, where are we meeting in the middle? So we had reached this point in the negotiation, in my view, and I told my staff, we're leaving. We're going to leave in the morning. We'll stop by the ministry to say our adieu. But we sent our luggage to the airport. It was just enough already, as they say. So there we are. And it was clear to the Chinese, this really was it. We were leaving. And then we were told that Zhu Rongji was in the building, had just arrived, and wanted to meet. And that's when the deal was finished. It's an interesting thing. When you've negotiated with someone a lot, as I had with Zhu Rongji, you come to decide if you can trust someone or not trust someone. If they're telling you the truth or they're not telling you the truth. If they really can do something, or if when they say they can't, they really mean they can't do it. They can't take that extra step. And I had reached the point with Zhu Rongji, and I think the same was true for him with respect to me, where I trusted him. Because we had developed that kind of rapport, and I think understood each other, understood the interests of our respective countries, we were able to come to terms on all of the outstanding issues. So it was a very dramatic moment, if you will, but one that I think even to this day was the right decision.
No, that's why we really like to thank you, not only for participating in this conference, but also for actually getting this going. I think we all benefited mightily from WTO accession of China, certainly more in the beginning than now, but at least it shows you can get things done with the Chinese and it benefits both sides. So Charlene, thank you so much and good evening to Washington, and let's do it again another time.
I would love to, and I'm just sorry I'm not there in person.
Take good care. Thank you, Charlene.
You too.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.